Cool. I'm letting folks in as they request to join. But we'll go ahead and get started. So everybody, welcome to our June office hours with Walter Chen, my former boss and now business partner at Superpath. As I mentioned in Slack and in our newsletter, this month is a little bit different in that this is open to everybody. Typically, this is something we just make available for Superpath Pro members. But given that it was Walter, I wanted to give everybody a taste of what office hours looks like. This is meant to be super informal. So if you want your video on, great. If you want it off, cool. You want to ask a question, leave in the chat or speak up. If you want to just hang out and listen, that's cool too. Meant to just be fun and very informal. I've got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to go ahead and just start. But maybe let's start with chat. If folks want to leave questions for Walter in chat, go for it, and then I can play moderator. So yeah, let's do it. Walter, how are you?
Doing all right. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, Walter I tweeted that people who do office hours, I send them a Superpath mug, and Walter requested to be part of it when he saw it.
To clarify, I asked for the mug.
Oh yeah, that's
true. Yeah. I asked for the mug, and then I got looped in. I'll do whatever it takes to acquire this mug.
They're pretty cool. There's only like 5 in existence. Could you maybe, well, I mean, I for the benefit of others, we've worked together for a long time. Obviously not everyone has as much context on who you are and what you've been up to for the past, I don't know, almost decade of starting businesses in the B2B space. So maybe could we start there? Could you just kind of like tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, definitely. So just a little bit background. So like as a kid, my dad is a math professor. So I learned how to code when I was a kid and just, built, random websites and stuff like that. But then I got sick of it. I went to college and studied computer science, got sick of it. Sorry, someone's loud.
It looks like nearly everyone's muted, but just as a reminder, if you guys don't mind muting, thank you.
Cool. Anyway, so I was super sick of programming and stuff like that. So I ended up going to law school and I became a lawyer. I practiced law for 2 years, and I got sick of that. And that's when I started my first company, which was a company called I Done This, which was like it was a little ahead of its time. It was like a remote stand-up tool. And we built it in like 2011. And we sold that in 2015. But the thing about that, sorry, you muted me. The thing about that experience was that we started writing blog posts on the company blog. Like we had no idea what we were doing and how to start a business. But we happened to know the Buffer guys really well. And this was, in 2011, right when they were getting started. And so they were like, oh, we're writing blog posts, and they're like doing well. So I was like, I can write blog posts, so started writing, blog posts too. And those started helping us get customers. And, it was like, write a blog post, get some customers. It was kind of like a strange experience, but that evolved in sort of like content marketing. So folks started to know I Done This for content, and got to know, people in B2B SaaS. So when we sold I Done This in 2015, a lot of people started asking me like, oh, can you help me with content for my company? And our first customer was Wistia, because I got to know Chris Savage during that time. And then, so we started Animals, and grew that over the last 4 years, and handed off the reins to Devin now, who's CEO, and Haley, who's COO, and then started this new company in the last year called Sakura, which is like a research platform for like startup investing, which we kind of like suck right now, but we're still trying to figure it out.
I want to ask you about Sakura. I'm going to come back to that though. When you were first getting started with Animals, did you have any hesitations about starting a service business? I mean, just given like your background in SaaS.
Yeah. So a lot of people were like, oh, you're starting an agency. I was like, no, it's not an agency. Like, let me explain to you. Like, it's like, it's going to be like a software enabled services business or whatever. And it's, we had this idea that, we could scale, the content that we were doing through various software we were using and we built. So like from day one, we actually started building like our own internal like content management system. And most of that money was wasted. It didn't actually probably increase productivity very much. And are probably around year 2 or ish, we ripped it all out and replaced it with Airtable. And then we started building stuff on top of that. So, the cycle continued. But yeah, so it wasn't until maybe year 2.5 that I sort of started to think about, oh, okay, it's actually as a services business. Like, let me embrace this. And when that happened, it really changed the business started performing a lot better. Like we went out and hired like people who would like manage accounts and junk like that, stuff that I like refused to do early on. So yeah, so we never conceived of it as a services business. And that was probably kind of like, the wrong frame, although we did get started. So I give myself credit for that. And then, but then later on, when we switched the frame of mind to like being like, yes, this is a services business, that helped us scale a lot more.
Yeah. And I remember when I first walked in the door at Animals in 2016 that I was actually struck by the type of content that was being created. I think I was expecting a lot of SEO content, and that's not what I found. Actually, it was one of the things that attracted me to join Animals, was that I saw a lot of, I guess what I would call thought leadership. Like the ideas were prioritized more so than keywords, which is, and it's like a tropey thing to say, but like when I started reading the stuff that the team was working on, I was really super impressed.
Yeah, the thing we always said from the beginning was that we were like McKinsey, the McKinsey of content or whatever. McKinsey, consulting firm. It's like we could actually come into your company and tell you how to run your business better, but instead we just write blog posts about it. So that was like the initial concept. So yes, very much so. Like we kind of thought about it from like the business perspective, less about it from like the writing or the content creation perspective, or the or that perspective. So like I think the thing that's always the hardest when you kind of like analyze content, there's all kinds of like dimensions along which you can say like, oh, content is bad or content is good. Does it perform or does it not perform? But I feel like ultimately like the hardest thing is like the quality of ideas. And those things are things that aren't like simple fixes. So like that was kind of one of the things that we tried to lead with, was that like we have high quality ideas that come from like a relatively deep understanding of like how to like run SaaS businesses and like what are the economics of running a SaaS business and some of those things. So yeah, that was like sort of very much the emphasis from early on. When you that kind of thing though is hard to scale. Right.
That's the next thing I was going to ask you.
Yeah. And so it's like we were, because like, for example, like, like I see Charlotte is here, she was early Animals team member. Awesome to see her here. And so like early on, Charlotte, some of these early people, Andrew, Peter, Jan, these folks like really kind of like went deep into it, and but that's the kind of thing that's hard to scale. As with every organization, it's hard to scale kind of like a generalist kind of kind of thing. You ultimately like sort of like fracture into like these different like specialties and subspecialties, and oftentimes you kind of like lose sight of the sort of bigger picture. But this is like a very natural process. So like now, for example, there is kind of like at Animals, there's someone who's like maybe very deep on SEO in particular, that has no regard for like this idea of like being able to go into someone's company and like tell them how to run their business better, right? But that's like just part of scaling. So yeah, I think we found that in the short term, this overemphasis on this idea that like everyone should be like Charlotte, where like Charlotte could go out and actually get a job at like McKinsey, but instead she's like writing content about it. That trying to scale that was not very practical. So it ended up being finding people who were once we identified the roles that we needed, then we could scale up those particular roles with a very specific like kind of like employee profile and understanding of like who would fit well into those roles, versus like just trying to hire like really, really smart, bright, young people, and like teaching them about SaaS businesses.
Right. I wonder, like there was a lot of like one-on-one coaching in the early days, like a lot of one-on-one work with individual writers on individual pieces. And maybe Charlotte disagrees, but I recall that being like pretty profound. Like that individual attention, like allow those people to get a lot better really quickly. And then like over time, it just becomes harder and harder to facilitate that. So you end up like documenting a lot of the knowledge along the way, but it has less of an impact. Like, did you find that was a challenge, or even in the first like 2 years, did you try to maintain like that one-to-one style, like coaching of individuals to keep the quality high?
Yeah, I think I definitely. It had mixed results because, and for some people, like it was, because it became it's very, very personal in style. And so some people respond to it and some people don't. And obviously too, there are general principles that I, as a manager or whatever, could be better at, and, did get better at, hopefully a little bit over time. But yeah, so there was I think there was a ton of one-on-one time early on, and that was part of what made it kind of fun. But also there was, there was a lot of interpersonal strife too. I mean, which is natural because there was kind of like a demand for, excellence or whatever, people like, and there was a like overwhelming amount of work. There was a lot of different factors. But that kind of approach doesn't really scale. Like Devin, actually, who's CEO now, I wouldn't say that she doesn't do one-on-one time, but she's not. She's has a very different approach that I think actually lends itself better to managing a services business. The problem with this kind of one-on-one approach is that you can like end up taking everything so personally. Anyone who's ever been involved in a services business, I'm sure there's a lot of people here who have. The thing about burnout that's so rife in services businesses is how personal it can get, and how you feel like you're letting people down, and you're disappointing people. People get mad. In a way, people treat you like a member of the team. It's like, for example, like you treat your family members like worse than you treat like strangers. You become sort of like a member of the team, but as part of that, you just get yelled at like every other team member. I think, part of what made it cool was how personal it was, but then also part of what results in burnout over time is how personal stuff is. I think the people who can thrive in the services style businesses are the ones who like have a clean kind of interface with their work, don't take things too personally, and can find can find the right mix and kind of find the stuff in it that's good and fun. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of like dependencies in an agency, between writers and their editors, between writers and account managers, between account managers and clients, from clients back to the writers. Like there's just a lot. There's a lot going on in addition to like, let's just try to write something great.
Yeah.
That actually becomes the easier thing over time.
I think that's a really good point. It's like, and this is both the kind of like the failure scenario, but also a thing that's very important to realize, which is basically like only a very small, part of being successful in an agency is achieving success for your clients and customers. I think it is important to have a maniacal focus on helping your customers win, even regardless, like putting that aside. The best agencies are maniacally focused on it, but understand too that that's like, just one of many things that they need to be thinking about. Delivering that service in a way that the customer appreciates, that they can understand what success is, that they can, that you're winning the whole organization over, that you're showing your results to everyone in the company, et cetera, et cetera. You're building relationships with the team. So yeah, absolutely. I think that excellence is like necessary, but not sufficient.
Yeah. That's interesting. Just a reminder, if folks do want to ask questions, just drop them in the chat. I can queue them up for Walter. I'm curious about Sakura. So you started a SaaS business that you grew with content marketing, and then you started a business where you create content for other businesses, and now you've started a company where content is the product. Oh, I guess one is like, what's next? What's the next version of that? But two, like how, like curious about, I would imagine selling when content is a product and you're trying to sell that quality, is your focus on quality different? Do you think about quality different when it is the product, versus it is trying to sell a different product? Also, could you tell us about Sakura? Most folks may not know exactly what it
Yeah.
is.
The idea is kind of like to do research on like startups or private companies. So, for example, public companies, have mandatory disclosures as a result of being public. And then there's a whole research industry around that. People who analyze those company disclosures and, make bull or bear calls, based on their analysis of those businesses. And so, the idea of Sakura was to like bring that to the private markets. The thing about like private companies is that they don't have to disclose information. Therefore, there's a much greater lack of information. Therefore, there's like a lack of analysis on these companies. And so most of the analysis that you see on startups is like thought pieces, you see like, I don't know if you heard like this term like think boy or whatever. People who kind of just like, spew their thoughts as if they were like truth. And a lot of those aren't startups because there's no kind of like disproving what they're, what people say or argue. So anyway, part of the concept of this company was to like both get access to and find information on private companies and then to do sort of reports and analysis on them. So yeah, that's the basic concept of Sakura. And then create like sort of like a research platform. So like, you can like find information on different, you can find different information on different companies depending on what you're looking for.
Yeah. I feel like
we're selling it. We're selling it to like VCs, but actually the big customer segment we're finding is big, large asset managers or funds that invest in public companies and that are starting to invest more in private, and both want to understand the private company space because they are a threat to their public holdings, but also because they want to sort of increase their exposure to private companies where there's a lot more growth.
That's interesting. I feel like the impact of a piece of content in this world is fairly high. You know what I mean? Like there's sort of like a low grade version of content where like, let's try to game an algorithm and get on a search page and there's almost no impact whatsoever. You know what I mean? Like if the content ends up being bad, hardly anyone is affected by that versus in a situation like this, the content has to be good because like potentially there's a lot of money hanging in the balance if folks are using it to make decisions.
I think that's true. I think there's a certain amount of truth to that, although I wouldn't poo-poo, ranking number one for different search terms. I mean, that can be very impactful, but I would say there's kind of, we're finding that there's kind of like two like jobs, you think about like jobs to be done or whatever for the research. One is that, yes, does it help investors make better investing decisions? There can be a lot at stake. But then there's kind of like this sub job, which is investors also need to market themselves. And you find this a lot. I mean, people hate on VCs because they're constantly like, doing content marketing. Essentially, most of these VCs are, glorified content marketers. So what's different in public versus private? Like in public, if I want to buy stock, I go to like TD Ameritrade or whatever and buy, company stock in, Coke or whatever. But in private, you really can only, for the most part, buy a company stock if they allow you to do so. And so getting a company to allow you to buy their stock involves often getting to know the founders or getting to know management. And in getting to know them, you're essentially marketing yourself to them. So we're finding that a lot of people are interested in reading our research because it helps them understand like how the company perceives itself, and therefore allows them to then market themselves better, the investor to market themselves better. So, while I kind of agree with what you said, it's in a way, it's also just sort of highfalutin. At the end of the day, a lot of like content is a lot of this stuff, and this was, sort of one of the things I try to convince people of is basically like, half of these like people in finance are just like content marketers basically. But let's say content marketers that like really like money. And the flip is that a lot of content marketers I talk to kind of like put themselves in a box and say that I'm a content marketer or I'm a writer or something like that. But if they kind of like, but there's no reason why they can't be a investment banker. I mean, not that you want to be, I'm just saying that one could be. They could take, it's just a matter of like, kind of like reframing your skill set. So So yeah, that's my my windy response to your question.
Yeah. I want to ask you in a second about skills, but Charlotte just asked, have you come across A16Z's publication future, and what do you think about it if you have?
Yeah, it looks cool. I mean, I guess it got kind of framed. So this is like Andreessen Horowitz's new like publication, because they're like has like this media arm. It seems to make sense. I haven't really dug into it. A couple, I guess, random thoughts. One is like they're calling it like Players Tribune, but for like venture capital. And I always think that there's I mean, Player Tribune is not a great business, but you attach it to a good business like a venture firm, one of the best venture firms in the world. Then maybe you have a good lead gen tool. But I always feel like this metaphor of the Players Tribune for X actually is a great one, because everyone wants, if you don't know what the Players Tribune is, basically it's like they're all mostly ghostwritten, but from the voice first person of an athlete, and oftentimes you get a perspective that you wouldn't, from like just general sports journalism written by journalists. A lot of time, I've sent Jimmy so many Players Tribune articles. Because a lot of them are, even though they're ghostwritten, like they're super, they're more emotional. They address the emotional side, or it's kind of like the inside baseball side, which I find very compelling. So as a kind of like construct of like of content or whatever, I think it makes sense. I think it's good. There's like good stuff in here. When I skimmed it, I saw a lot of it was like aggregated, like Substack type posts. Like, you see like from Lenny, that dude, the PM guy, you have like Wes Cow, you have like, a lot of these other people. And I don't really like the Substack style. I kind of earlier derided some of it as like Think Boy stuff. So, I'm not a huge fan of that, but I think there's probably good stuff here. I think it speaks to an opportunity for a lot of content marketers and journalists too, which is kind of like repositioning, how to like reposition your work, not as marketing, but as something else. And even though while all of this is marketing in a way and does a job of marketing, it's not positioned as such, and therefore it's perceived to be higher value. That's like one of the things that I would kind of like encourage like everyone to think about a little bit.
Yeah, that's actually interesting you say that, because I wanted to come back to skills that make for a good content marketer. But one thing you mentioned was that, well, you've told me many times over the years, you think content is like, potentially like an incredibly valuable, lucrative career path if taken the right way. But often what happens is that folks, they sort of discover this world and then deem themselves a content marketer or a writer. And that actually kind of puts a ceiling on their trajectory, because as you mentioned, like investment bankers are basically just highfalutin content marketers. I'm just curious if you have more thoughts on that. Like, do you see a trend where more folks are figuring out that the skills that make for a good content marketer actually can be kind of more flexible, that we can use the critical thinking, good writing, marketing skills to go do other potentially, I hate to say bigger, better, but just outside of like basically the B2B SaaS world?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a growing recognition. I think salaries are going up. I mean, you've talked about this. I think the salaries are going up in content and in marketing in general. I think there's a general recognition that it's hard to hire really great marketers and content people. And I think so. I think in general, like this category of work, I mean, is on the rise. I think people see that this category of work, the things that are involved, are really applicable, to other areas. So I would separate this kind of like skill set. There's like this question of like, there are a few pieces. I don't know what you call yourself, I think is actually a relatively important piece. Then there's kind of like your skill set. And then there's like how you monetize that skill set. So for example, like, I don't know if people are following like Legion or, Lenny Ratisky or whatever, I can't pronounce his name, Packy McCormick, these people with Substacks. So they are essentially the activity or the skill set they probably have that's probably the best is their content marketing skill set. And you might say that Lenny was a PM, but I never heard that Lenny was the world's greatest PM. Nothing against Lenny. I don't know if anyone here knows Lenny or even cares, but let's say I never heard that Lenny was the world's greatest PM. I heard that he was a PM at one of the greatest product companies ever, Airbnb. of which you drop like 75% of people in this chat into that role, and they will be successful. Nothing against Lenny again. But he left and started a Substack where he wrote about, being a PM at Airbnb. And I think he's probably the thing he's best at is creating content about being a PM at Airbnb, right? But one, he never calls himself a content marketer, which I think is actually good. Two, he has a really strong content marketing skill set. And three, he doesn't monetize as a marketer in a way. He monetizes as a kind of like small business owner. But then as a business owner, someone who owns this newsletter and his revenue stream from it, but then also is monetizing as a AngelList syndicate. He runs an AngelList syndicate, which means that he's essentially monetizing as a kind of a form of an investor, where if he created a syndicate is essentially an email list for investing. So if I were like, I created a syndicate, it's like, I give you a link to AngelList and you hit subscribe on that list, and now you're part of my syndicate. So essentially and then what does that mean? That means when I send out updates to the syndicate, you get them, right? So it sounds like an email list, right? Except the thing is, when you sign up to invest, I get a cut of it, So I'm monetizing based on driving, demand for various investments that I'm making. And so like Lee Jin, again, great content marketer, is trying to but essentially monetizes as, never calls herself a content marketer, calls herself a venture capitalist or creator, and then monetizes through fees and carry as an investor. Packy is also positioning himself as an investor and then selling ads on his newsletter. So most of these are applying this skill set of content marketing, but to like different domains. And I think the key is kind of like there are a couple of things. One is ownership, building your own brand, blah, 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 blah. I mean, and then the other is monetizing in a way. So like fees and carry, for example, you can monetize. It is unbounded upside. And that is a big component. Same with, and so unbounded upside, but then also monetizing success, essentially. So like, for example, investment bankers, take a cut of, deal size and stuff like that. So like these are different elements that demand like that you like when I asked to monetize in this way, I'm asked to treat my skill set as equal and a value add such that I demand and are owed a portion of the result, right? That's how highly I regard my skill set. It's the same skill set, right? But a lot of it is this kind of like confidence game. Hopefully not like a shell of a confidence game, but it's like where you kind of like are able to both demand and literally, or in some sense, actually add value such that you demand a part of it. Anyway, that was a ramble. I don't know if any of that was interesting.
No, I think it's interesting because it's kind of the world that I'm in now. I think one thing is kind of, I find Substack to be mostly annoying, but kind of cool. And I think one of the things that's kind of cool is it's opened a bunch of subject matter experts' eyes to monetizing their ideas through content. And like, obviously that happened before Substack, it will happen after Substack, but it's kind of created this sort of, it just sort of presented the concept in a super easy way. And, some small percentage of the people who do it are winning by doing it. Interesting what you said. It's kind of been, I think this is what you were saying. Like the folks who go into content marketing and sort of deem themselves content marketers, they're essentially monetizing for someone else. So there's no upside. And the attractive thing about Substack or Patreon or whatever other sort of creator economy tool that folks end up gravitating towards is that you actually can monetize your own subject matter expertise. And the ability to do that, you actually have to have a lot of subject matter expertise. Whereas to work, say, in-house at a content or at a SaaS company doing content marketing, you can facilitate other people's subject matter expertise rather than just having it yourself. You know what I mean? But like you said, you end up relying on the same skills. But to sort of get to the point, like for folks who work in content, like that's something to think about working towards over time, the monetizing for yourself, not just, there's nothing wrong with a 9 to 5 job. It actually, I miss it sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
But there's a lot of opportunity out there.
Yeah, for sure. One should never sort of like, I'm not meaning ever to suggest that like one thing is what people should do or is a better form of it. I would say that like, if you want to make more money, like a lot of, a common move people make is like, yeah, you're a marketer. And then as you level up, you like, you call you transition into something else. And as part of that, you sort of call yourself something different. And I'm sort of encouraging people to think slightly differently about that. I think I see a trap people often get into, which is, and I do this a lot too, which is like kind of like this like reverse thing, which is like those that start, it's like this guy I knew in high school, his name was like Andrew or whatever. And then I found out like he went to University of Chicago and he started calling himself Liam, because that was his middle name. There were too many Andrews, so he wanted to stand out. And I was like, what, you're too good for our hometown? Like, you're too good to call yourself Andrew? But it's like, you know what I mean? It's kind of like the same thing too. So it's like, there's always there are like deliberate and conscious kind of like things you can do to reframe like how people perceive you, and how you position yourself, and how you kind of like ask for more, or demand more or whatever. And so I just want to encourage some people to think about that, because I feel like, as again, the kind of motivation is like, I see content marketing as a skill set to be incredibly valuable. I feel like the trap people get in is like kind of like not being close enough to the money, not being close enough to like to then demand like a part of like the value creation. And so that's just what I want to encourage people to think about.
Yeah, that's cool. Switching gears, we have a content strategy question for you in the chat. Emily asks, what are your thoughts about podcast or video series for B2B SaaS companies? Is it already oversaturated? / how do you stand out?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I'm pretty close with Wistia, so I feel like if I say anything against this, it would come off the wrong way. I am a fan. And I was not to plug. I was in a video series for Podia.
Oh, for Podia,
yeah. So check that out. It's pretty embarrassing, but so yeah, I think as with everything, you kind of get these questions all the time. So like taking it back to sort of like basic principles, which is like, is it oversaturated? Possibly. But is there always room for like quality and signal? Yes, I think so. And I think there are always going to be like, let's say Wistia, which is like done something really well and then pushes it forward as a trend. And then a bunch of people follow them and try to do it, but then do really crappy versions of it. And then you start to feel like it's oversaturated. But that doesn't mean that the thing is oversaturated in a way. It just means that it's just a byproduct of like this kind of follow-on imitation, which is always follows success. So in terms of thinking about whether I should do X, I would never dismiss X merely because there's a lot of crappy versions of X. I would like kind of like study why I think they suck and how we could do better. But I also too wouldn't just follow on the flip side. I wouldn't follow on just because I saw Wistia do it well. A lot of it is like is like kind of like ingesting this information in terms of like who's doing it. There's a trend, someone's telling you to do X, you like look at a bunch of it, you consume a bunch of information around it, you see what makes something good, what makes something bad, and then you pair it with your own skill set and what you're good at, you as an individual, you as an organization, and then you see like you think about whether you should do it or not on that basis, I think, which is the sort of intersection of it being something you're really good at and it being something that makes that type of content like really stand out and really successful. So yeah, I would say don't write it off, but at the same time too, don't like blindly follow. This is like the worst kind of advice. I don't know is this helpful? I don't.
I might be reading into your question, Emily, but I think maybe part of this is it worth spending the money? Like those things are, whether they are actually more expensive or just perceived as more expensive than written content. Like I think sometimes written content is perceived as cheap because it's just a person in a Google Doc. there's no like specialized software. Like you don't have to hire people who charge a lot of money hourly to, you know, clean up your videos and audio or whatever. Um, so maybe I think there's sort of another shade to this question, which is like, how much can you invest in content marketing and still get a return out of it? Which is, I'm not necessarily expecting you to answer that question,
Yeah,
but
I feel like, there's always kind of like these kind of like, gradations and ways to kind of like, like ease into the pool, so it's like you're dipping your toe in the pool and then you're putting your whole foot in or whatever. With video, there's always like a low production value way to try something. I mean, I think, if COVID has taught us anything, it's like production value is kind of like, takes a back seat to content. Because, there's a lot of, we started to see a lot of people in their, pajamas, like with low quality video. The question, on like, MSNBC or whatever, but the question is like the quality of the content. So I think, people I would say on this front, people sort of like tend to overvalue production quality and undervalue content. And I feel like that's a very powerful and true statement. And in overvaluing production quality, I think what they're overvaluing is image. Basically, the idea of creating something presentable and not embarrassing. Um, and the problem with that is that it's contrary to what makes good content, which I think a huge portion of it is making yourself vulnerable and putting yourself out there. So you can always attempt to cover up bad content by spending more money. And that's why I always try. That's why I, in part is an excuse too, because I'm quite, I'm stingy, but it's like, that's why I'm always like, let's not spend money on this. Let's like produce a version of this that like, doesn't cost us very much money to do. And the idea is in part like focus on the content. So, that would be my take.
Do you have any thoughts on how to find good ideas? Like that was one of the things I recall working on a lot at Animals, especially in the early days, was like there was a difference between a topic to write about and an idea. And I think that when you sort of get to a point in your content career where you can very easily distinguish those two things, you're going to experience like much more rapid, like personal or career growth, because the ideas are the thing. Anyone can write about topics. So you're curious, like, anything, especially from like the kind of the one-on-one like coaching aspect of like those early days of Animals, like how do you help people like get to that point?
Yeah, I find that at least the characteristic that I observed in people who could, take this on quite quickly is, and this is very context specific, so I'm not meaning to say some people are like this and others are not, but is curiosity. And what basically curiosity for, the subject matter that you're doing marketing for or whatever. And that drives basically a lot of content consumption. And I feel like a lot of content consumption is important. If you talk to, I don't know if you've had this experience where you're like talking to another marketer or talking to a founder or something like that. And you're like, oh, it's like that article. Did you read that article X? And they're like, yeah, and then you're like, oh yeah. And then later on in the conversation, you're like, oh, this reminds me of this other article. And they're like, yeah. Like like when Jimmy and I talk too, like we've read so much of the same, there's so much stuff we've consumed, so many points of reference, and ways to kind of like and I think that just is important because once you it's hard to like kind of know what the key I think is knowing what's interesting, and it's hard to know what's interesting if you haven't read a bunch of stuff and you yourself are not really curious or interested in the topic. So I think the difference is a lot of times is, so I would say two things. One, the difference between like writing about a topic and writing like having a good angle or whatever is like identifying what's interesting. And then the second is that, I forgot what I was going to say. I set it up, with two things and then I only said one thing. And, let me just think for a sec. Yeah, I forgot. Sorry. Yeah. So
that's all good. I recall like early days at Animal, someone might be writing a piece on like time tracking for like a human resource or like a, like a whatever HR SaaS app or whatever, and you would say to them something like, you would read their draft and then you'd be like, why don't you read this article from Paul Graham on like what is a startup? And they'd be like, what?
Yeah.
But it was clear you wanted them to have this like foundational context where they understood like what is a startup, why do they take on funding, why is SaaS so important, why are there now like all these niche SaaS companies, like to provide as much context as possible so that person could then understand like kind of where this particular company and then this very specific idea fits into this much larger picture.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. Thank you for saying things much more eloquently than I did. Yeah, this kind of, well, Paul Graham has been canceled, so let's not refer to him. But I think, one thing, actually, well, this is like Paul Graham related, but I think that like at Y Combinator, one of the things that they say about YC interviews, and I interviewed multiple times and was rejected each time. So one of the things they say is like, basically Paul Graham thinks you're a moron. If he asks you a question, he thinks you're a moron if it takes more than 2 sentences to answer. So I think, for most of the content, people struggle. If you ask them like, what's a concise statement on why this is interesting, they'll have a hard time explaining why they're writing the blog post or why it should be compelling. So I think one, that's just a simple test. It's like, can you state in like 2 sentences why this is interesting? And and then the other is that as a lawyer, one of the things, I used to be a lawyer, and one of the things that I think is interesting is that each case is different in a way. Each and the way that it's different is like it has a unique fact pattern. And so one of the things that is a skill set of a lawyer is basically like, like you give me 2 things and I'll tell you how they're the same, and then give me 2 things, I'll tell you how they're different. And so the ability to kind of like play with ideas in your mind such that you can say like, let's put it in very concrete terms. I read the top 15 search results for this keyword or whatever. And I'm positioning this blog post in my mind in a way that's like different from them in this way, but the same as them in this other way. Right. And I think both elements are really important. You want it to be the same in some sense because these are the top posts. So there's something, there are things about them that make them work. But you want it to be different in a way, and not just different, but extremely evident how it's different. And evident in a way, the proxy or the kind of like crystallization of how evident it's different is often manifested in the title, right? So like if you can tell me that what the title is, not because I care what the title is, but because I care that what the title is, and the title embodies what makes this different and the same in a way, that is what is kind of like the first sentence of the 2 sentences, that make you not stupid. I mean, in a certain term. Yeah. I didn't mean to say stupid in some kind of crude way, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Also, I find that when you get to that part, when you get to the good title and it perfectly captures the idea, the article then becomes really easy to write versus the other way around.
For sure. This goes back to what we were talking about before, which is like the hardest work isn't the writing in a way. It's that the writing is like a process for which you like synthesize your ideas. And then once you have the idea, then it's easy to write. I mean, it's easy to say, but that is, sort of in essence, it.
Yeah. I dig it. Rocco asked, what's your daily routine like? Curious how your average day pans out. I'm curious about this too.
Yeah. So I'm like one of the least productive people on earth. Okay. I'm extremely unproductive. Everyone, I would say 95% of people here are more productive than I am. I am, I subscribe to the school of basically that, being successful basically buys you the right to like do whatever you feel like doing. I mean, not that I'm successful, but like I'm aspiring to be successful. And as part of my aspiration, I'm practicing being able to do whatever I want. Right. So, I wake up, well, first of all, I don't sleep very well because a light sleeper and dog, and some snoring from some other people who will remain nameless. So I might be up at 5, I may be up at 6, but not because I'm super productive, because I can't sleep. And then I kind of like, I play FIFA, maybe I watch YouTube. I probably start work around 7 or 8. It depends. I might start at 6 if I have nothing else to do. And then I work to around noon. I eat lunch, and then I take a nap. It's usually like an hour long or hour, ish. So I'm probably out from 1 to 3 or 4 ish. Because there's all this stuff around the nap, like lying down and falling asleep and then waking up and Anyway, this is not interesting, but so 4 o'clock I'm back. So 4 o'clock ish I'm back, and and then I work till like 7 or something. And maybe later sometimes. And the other thing I've done is I put all my meetings on Thursday. So now I don't take meetings except on Thursday for the most part. So
that's interesting.
Yeah, and also, I never drank coffee, but I just started drinking coffee recently because I thought it kind of tasted good. So now I start my day off too with a cup of coffee. Also, sometimes I take my dog out in the morning. Anyway, this is so boring. So, but the one thing I would like to be is a hope to people who are not very productive. I'm kind of like more ADD kind of type. So having a hard time focusing, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's me.
Honestly, I'm relieved that you didn't say it. I get up at 5 and then I meditate, then I drink.
That's you, Jimmy.
Specialty.
That's
you.
Not
me. I just get up. I get up whenever our kid gets up.
Nice. You used to be productive.
Yeah, I did used to be. I'm kind of along the same lines. Like, how do you split your time between Sakura and then everything else? I mean, you've invested in a number of businesses. Like, are you interacting with them on a daily, weekly, monthly basis? I mean, I assume there's probably quite a bit that goes into vetting companies, working with founders on a regular basis.
Yeah. I found that I'm like semi-actively investing in companies. I'm probably actually, there's a lot of people who talk about investing on Twitter, but I actually probably invest more money than they do. Just, a little brag about myself. I found out, like, there was a guy who was like an investor at a real firm. They say like they have like $800 million under management or whatever, or their first fund was like $800 million. And then he told me he had invested like X amount in the first 3 months. I was like, I did more than that.
That's funny.
So anyway, respect to me. No, I'm kidding. So yeah, it has been quite, actually. The thing is, it gets investing, for example, it's like I've been putting myself forward as like value add or whatever, which is like, I don't know, it's kind of lame, but it's like I actually try to help people. So a lot of founders do ask me for help, especially with content and stuff like that. And normally I don't really know the answer, guys. I don't really know anything about content at this point. That's why I was like, Jimmy, are you sure you want me on this call? Because I really actually don't know anything about content. The question, when Emily asked me a real content question, I was like, oh crap. So yeah, for the most part, people will try to ask me questions about content, and then I'll sort of not pawn them off, but try to connect them with someone who can actually help them, who knows something about content. So that oftentimes that's like Jimmy or other people. So the thing I found was that in putting yourself forward as like kind of like helpful or whatever, people actually take you up on that sometimes. And then if you're too busy, then you start to kind of you're not doing some of the things that you should be doing or want to be doing. And then I take it kind of personally, and I like sort of was feeling like a little depressed about it, like I was letting people down or whatever. Like, I said I was going to help with X and then I didn't. So this year I was like, well, let me try to invest a little less, let me try to write fewer checks, but like bigger ones into the companies that mean the most to me. So I doubled down on at least like 3, companies that have done really well, that, have a great relationship with the founders and that have meant something, from like kind of like a spiritual-ish, kind of thing where it's like, yeah, this company means something to me, perspective. So I've been trying to do that. I did end up writing a bunch of random checks to like random startups that I thought were cool or interesting, unfortunately. But so yeah, that has been actually a big problem because I'm also trying to run this company too, but yeah, I'm trying to just like concentrate and focus a little bit more. That's and do this by cutting stuff out.
Yeah. One last chance for folks to drop questions in chat. I think it's pretty cool that I think what you've done, which is basically take a popular SaaS blog, and I've done this, and then parlay it into an agency, another company, enough, generate enough revenue and personal income through those companies that you can now invest. Like I don't know that there's a better like content trajectory than that one.
Well, so first of all, it's very personal. So it's all up to what people want to do. There's all and every person finds their own path. But yeah, and so half the stuff I'm talking about is just stuff that I've been thinking about for myself. Like people think of me as like, oh, Walter's like a content guy, right? There's nothing wrong with being a content person per se. But I also too, I'm like, okay, I can be a content person in this situation, and I can help someone, as a content person in this situation. But I think of myself as not a content person, but let's say someone who builds and creates companies, based on being able to, identify talent and build teams and nurture talent and that kind of thing. For example, you know what I mean? And so like I was talking with Elizabeth Yin the other day, who's like investor at Hustle Fund, and she had talked to Haley, who is the CEO of Animals. And she asked me, how do you hire someone like Haley? Like actually, she's like, the thing that always stands out to me about the people you work with is that they, there's some really, really good people, like people kind of like you don't, a little unexpected, you know what I mean? And so like I think of, so I conceive of myself in a kind of like a different vein. And, that's just like part of this whole, kind of like storytelling, of like, life narrative that's going on in my head, which is totally irrelevant to everybody else. But just kind of sharing a little bit of that with the folks here, like how I think about that and how that has kind of like helped me a little bit in sort of like, because a lot of folks, a lot of people have great founders, CEOs, have started out as marketers, and it's a great path for people. And I think content is at a core kind of skill set that really does help with building companies too, if that's something you're interested in.
Yeah. Cool. I love it, man. We're getting up on time. I think you've earned your Superpath mug, which I'll put in the mail this afternoon.
Sweet.
Do you want to plug anything, Sakura, or anything else?
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
I'll plug Sakura for you.
Yeah. We're trying to grow our email list. So yeah, if you go to sakura.com and sign up, that'd be really helpful. Just like the rest of everyone in here, just trying to grow the email list, one email subscriber at a time.
Yeah. Honestly, I think Sakura's cool because the one, you just learn a lot. Like if you read some of the investor reports, like they're just insanely detailed. It's really cool. That is like some of that foundational context that I think can actually help people be better at their jobs, whether they're writing or thinking about strategy or whatever. And I also think it's interesting to study the business model. Like I've watched closely how you guys tried to figure out like what's free, what's not, how much do you charge? Like it's sort of complicated. And I've run into the same problem with Superpath and Superpath Pro, where you don't, you have to be able to create enough to attract people, but then you still have to save some good stuff that makes it worth paying for and whatever. So anyways, would recommend that people go check it out, sakura.com. I'll obviously link to that.
Cool. Thanks, Jimmy.
Cool. Walter, thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And if anyone wants to email me too, just email me, walter.chen@gmail.com. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I hope I didn't say something really stupid. So thanks. No. Thanks for everyone's forbearance or whatever on anything, on any of that.
I think you're good, man. Right, cool. Thanks everybody for coming. June office hours is wrapped, and we'll see everybody in Slack. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.